welcome to the Chirp YouTube channel. I am Christy. I am your friendly online speech language pathologist and specialist in children's communication development, including behavior, because behavior is a type of communication. Today, we are going to take a quick moment to talk about sensory aversions and sensory avoidances, especially in the realm of feet, because feet are very sensitive. I have talked about sensory aversion in the past, and of course I have an entire series of videos on the 9 sensory modalities, how we can recognize needs in those areas, and how we can help kids function better, even if they need a little more input into those different sensory channels. However, we didn't talk a lot in that series about sensory avoidance. And it's an issue that has been coming up in my personal life more lately with the kids that I work with. And there are a lot of misunderstandings about kids, about sensory systems, and about how we can help kids function better. This issue is one that I have personal experience with because I had a lot of issues with socks and shoes when I was a kid. A lot. I would spend a lot of time before school in the morning when I was in early elementary school trying to adjust the seam of my socks so it was just right, trying to position the tongue of my shoes so it was just right, being really irritated when my sock would get all bunched up inside of my boot. It wasn't just distracting, it was painful. There are some people in the world to whom certain sensory stimuli are painful. It's not just that we are picky, it's that our sensory system isn't processing certain kinds of input in the same way everyone else's sensory system does. We are all unique individuals and we have unique sensory systems. They don't all work in the same way. This is why some kids are fidgety. Some people need to play with a pencil. Some people tend to bite their fingernails or twirl their hair. These are all sensory coping strategies that help people to stay calm and regulated even in tense circumstances. These are inputs into the sensory system. The sensory system is all the ways that details, information about the exterior world get transmitted into us. So my eyes tell me visual information about the world. My nose tells me olfactory information about the world. All of the sensory modalities from that series tell me more information about the world around me. Some sensory systems are a little bit hungry, shall we say. They crave more sensory stimulation from those particular pathways. You can find out more about that in that series. I'm not going to talk too much about that. Where I want to go with this is that some sensory systems are full. They want no more input into that particular sensory channel. This is what happens with sensory avoidance or aversion. A particular sensory channel is very sensitive and does not want more of that kind of input. That may be the tactile sense, which is the sensation that we get through our skin. That is called tactile input, which is what is happening with our feet when we don't have the right kind of seam on our socks or when our shoe is not right and it causes pain. But of course, with socks and shoes, there's also a lot of other kind of input. For example, there is proprioceptive input, which means the squeezing of muscles and ligaments and joints. Proprioceptive input can be too much. Some kids want more. Some people need less. We need less stuff squeezing on us because it feels painful. I would like to take a moment here to say, once again, that people whose sensory systems are hooked up differently are not doing this on purpose. They're not just being persnickety. They're wired up differently, just like an introvert versus an extrovert, or all the different personality types that you no doubt have read about. We're all a little bit different. Yes, we're composed of atoms, and yes, we have similar shapes, but there are some really unique intricacies about each one of us that mean that we are a little bit different. And we definitely need to be a little more accepting, or a lot more accepting, of people who are different from us. Let me say some more about feet. Number one, kids can be very sensitive to stimulation on their feet. Feet are very sensitive. Fingertips and toes, very sensitive. We don't like our feet to be sore because we're walking on them all the time. We don't like things to squeeze our feet too tightly because it hurts. I remember the feeling of not being able to focus on what I was supposed to be learning at school because my socks were so uncomfortable to my skin. If we care that some kids can't learn when they're hungry, which makes all the sense in the world. We don't want anyone to be hungry when they're trying to learn. If we care that some kids have a headache or are ready to throw up and cannot learn because their body is uncomfortable, then we also need to take into account the fact that some kids will not be able to participate in learning if they're having a sensory need that is not being met. And uncomfortable socks or shoes, or anything on the feet at all in some cases, may be one of those things for any particular child. I do see this a lot in children that I work with who have different developmental trajectories. Children with autism specifically, because sensory differences are part of that diagnosis. It's one of the diagnostic criteria of an autism spectrum disorder is that your sensory system is different. So, if we want children to be able to learn, we have to accommodate their different sensory systems, which may mean that children in our classroom do not need to wear their shoes, or that we have slipper socks that don't have a seam available for these kids if they need them, so they don't feel distracted by discomfort and pain. We do the same thing, allowing kids a break when they have a headache or when they're sick in other ways. We do the same thing. We feed children when we know that they haven't eaten because we can't expect them to learn if they are hungry. We need to have the same compassion towards children with different sensory systems. Sometimes these different sensory systems can be part of a diagnosis. As I mentioned, autism is one of these diagnoses where commonly children are very sensitive to sensory stimuli. Sometimes they crave more of a particular sensation. Sometimes the sensation is too much and it overwhelms them and it's painful. These require professionals to assess. So inform yourself, and if you are a parent or a family member, please get an occupational therapist who's a specialist in sensory integration. I have a list down below. I have a link to sensory smart occupational therapy providers. Hopefully you can find one in your area. If you can't, there is a list of books down below that can help you. And of course, that video series that I did should be able to help you also, so that you can recognize some of those needs in your child's or your student's and life and meet some of those needs in more appropriate ways. As far as shoes and socks go, the best way to deal with this is to choose your battles what is more important to you? That a child wear the shoes and socks and not be able to access the learning, or that your child perhaps doesn't wear the shoes and socks, but is listening, participating, paying attention, making friends, interacting? I think it's pretty clear. I realize that there are some classroom requirements because of safety, but you cannot force a child to wear shoes. You cannot force me to wear shoes. I'm not wearing shoes right now, or socks, and I'm much more comfortable. But I was able to eventually learn how to regulate myself, even if my socks and shoes were uncomfortable. But it was a long process for me. I am a relatively typically developing human. I had some sensory needs when I was a child. I didn't have super great social emotional skills early on in my life. I was able to learn those things. I was able to be successful in school and outside of school, have relationships. There's all sorts of stuff about me that is pretty typical. But the sensory system is one area of myself that is not quite typical. It could be much less typical, but I had to give it time. My teachers had to be patient with me. My parents had to be patient with me. I needed time to let my body become accustomed to being affected by certain things in ways that were not my preference. And I was able to learn those things. My sensory system was able to calm down. It started out oversensitive, but it was able to calm down over time. So I think that many children will also be able to learn those skills of calming themselves down, even if they're wearing uncomfortable socks. However, we as the grown-ups in this situation need to be accommodating. We need to be compassionate. The last video I posted right up here was about shaming children and how that sort of manipulation and coercion doesn't do anyone any benefits. Please watch that video, because we all need a bit of a paradigm shift in the way that we teach, in the way that we relate to kids and to each other. We need to do it with love. We need to teach in relationship. We need to grow in relationship. None of us needs to or wants to be manipulated or coerced. And in the line of that, we cannot coerce or manipulate a child into keeping her shoes on. We can't do it. We can keep on reminding them every 2 seconds, put your shoes on, put your shoes on, but it's not going to have an effect, because there's a reason behind the lack of shoe wearing that we clearly aren't understanding. All the other children are wearing their shoes and this one isn't. There's a reason for that. And if we don't know what the reason is, we can't deal with the issue. And in my opinion, it's not even an issue, because who cares? Who cares? A lot of successful people don't like to wear shoes, and they're fine. Most of our classrooms are not carpeted by glass shards or burning lava. And even if they were, shoes probably won't help, especially the Crocs that kids are wearing most of the time these days. As I mentioned in the previous video, we need to begin all behavior management with relationship. And once again, I'm going to point to this series up here about behavior, about challenging behavior, and how to prevent and manage challenging behavior. The prevention is the important part. The management only comes if we failed at the prevention, which so often we do because we're not very equipped to deal with prevention. And so then we come along and we just decide the best way to manage this is by a lot of control and manipulation, and we try to coerce children into behaving better. But that doesn't work, because there are deeper issues that we need these children. There are things they need to learn. There are skills that they don't have. One of those skills is staying calm, keeping their sensory systems calm. Let me go back to this little child I'm thinking of. Before Before I started working with him, he was constantly trying to escape the classroom. He was just leaving. And by the way, I have a really good video on elopement, which is kids running away from situations into unsafeness. He would run away a lot. He would run around the room a lot, and he was pretty distracting. When I started working with him, I started by building a relationship with him, not trying to control him or make him look like all the other kids, but I wanted to know him. I wanted to know his capabilities. I wanted to know what's going on in his head. I wanted to get to know his unique sensory system out of love. This is where we should start with kids. We should start with love rather than manipulation. So, what I learned was he is extremely smart. He was able to listen and understand the lessons, even ones that were developmentally above where I thought was appropriate for his age. And he was able to succinctly summarize many of those lessons and share that with his peers, which was fantastic. What I also learned was he did these things better if he wasn't wearing his shoes. Therefore, I decided, yeah, we can work on the shoes thing over time, but that is not going to be an area of focus for me. If he comes here and he learns that he is loved, he is welcomed and accepted, he has friends here, if he hears what we teach and is able to encapsulate that and share it, that's what I want for him. If he wears shoes while doing that, that's another step in a direction towards a successful adulthood, perhaps. But if he doesn't wear shoes, but he did all those other things, I still consider that a success. I think it's my job as someone who understands children, not only from almost 25 years of experience working with children, but from the education that I received. I think it's my job to encourage everyone else in society and help all of us understand children better. I think that's what I'm here to do. So if you watched this video, thank you. I think you understand children better than you did before. And I appreciate that because we can all stand to be more compassionate, especially if we're old. We sometimes forget what it was like to be a child. And sometimes we get so attached to our own, what we believe our goal to be, that we don't take into account that children are individuals. They have unique abilities, and they don't necessarily care about our agenda. And yeah, we can shame and try to force kids into caring about our agenda, but it doesn't benefit anyone. What benefits everyone is relationship. Loving, compassionate, playful relationship that allows us all to learn and grow and to be connected to each other. That is how children flourish, is through connection. I also want to reiterate from the previous video from last week that when a child is not doing something that I think that child should be doing, then I need to look at myself. I need to think, if I have a child in my classroom who is not wearing shoes, and I want to force that child to wear shoes because I feel like it makes me look less professional, or I just want to control that kid because I really, really like looking like I have everything under control and looking like my kids in this class all look the same. They're all behaving just how I want. That is an adult ego sort of thing. That's not developmentally appropriate. So, at least not for this kid. So I need to look at myself and think, I'm constantly doing this, and think, okay, My hope for that child was that he would be able to not be a distraction during class. He would communicate using words, and he would not need any sort of sensory input during this class period. And if the child can't do that, then I'm disappointed, or I kind of shame him a little bit by making a face or telling him I'm disappointed. That's a me problem. I'm expecting too much of that child. This little guy that I'm thinking of, at this point in his development, he might be able to keep his shoes on through the lesson, but I'm not sure he can keep his shoes on and pay attention to the lesson and interact with his peers. I don't think he can do all of those. So we need to take a pick what we think is the most important. I think most of us would probably agree, most of us who care about kids, most of us who work with kids, I think we would agree that the paying attention, the awareness of what's going on in the teaching, and the ability to interact with peers and build relationships, I think most of us would agree that that's much, much more important than wearing shoes or socks. I talked a little bit more about manipulation and coercion in this video than I sort of intended to, because it is so much on my mind right now, because we don't treat children with respect. I understand that there are times, of course, that we need children to be safe. We need children to obey us, of course. But shaming them and trying to manipulate them into doing that is not a way to a healthy relationship. And it's not a way for us to create healthy children who grow into healthy adults. We need to help them to learn, and it all needs to start with acceptance of what they are currently able to do. In my field, we call this area of where kids learn best the zone of proximal development, or the ZPD, which means that this is what the child can do. Let me do it this way. This is what the child can do. The next thing that I want the child to do is here. The child cannot jump that distance alone. So what I do is I bridge that somehow. Children learn best when they are comfortable and calm and regulated, but they don't learn anything if they're not challenged a little bit. If they're challenged too much, they will shut down or try to escape, which was what was happening with this little guy and so many other kids. If they're not challenged at all, they don't learn anything or grow. Our job as the grown-ups is to figure out what the kid is capable of doing by herself, and then we push it just a little bit. So in this case, my agreement with this young kid was, you can keep your shoes off when you're sitting down on your rug, but if you get up and walk anywhere, let's put our shoes on, because then we're being a good example. I'm not shaming him for not wearing his shoes. I'm not reminding him every 5 seconds, put your shoes on, put your shoes on, put your shoes on. I'm allowing him to do what I believe that his body needs for him to be able to stay calm and learn and interact with other people. But I am pushing him a little bit at a time. If it becomes super comfortable, then we can work on the next step, which is keeping his shoes on all the time. But for now, we have an agreement, and I think it's a good one. In my last classroom that I ran, the last program that I ran, many of the kids would come into the classroom and we had a cubby. Now, all these kids were kids with diagnoses of various kinds. Some of them were just behavioral. Some of them were pretty much only sensory. Some of them were more intense than that, with more symptoms and needs. However, we had a special cubby. Most of the kids came in, they took their shoes off, sometimes their socks, and they put their shoes in the cubby. Because I knew shoes are a big trigger for some of our kids. Socks are a big trigger for some of our kids. Their parents don't care, and the kids are much more comfortable, much more able to learn if they are not irritated and uncomfortable. Also, just kind of as an addendum, one of my dearest friends lives in Hawaii, and she told me that it's such a part of the culture there to be barefoot that many children don't wear shoes even at school until after 4th grade, which I find interesting. So we also need to be aware that there are cultural differences that affect shoes and feet. And we need to be careful, especially if you have any students who are of Polynesian backgrounds, that they may have been taught something different. There may be something different going on at home or at whatever school they do attend. That means that it's very awkward for them to wear shoes when they come to a place of learning. So keep that in mind. And I hope that you are thinking about some ways to be accommodating towards some of the kids in your own life who might have some sensory aversions, maybe even shoes and socks. There are, of course, lots of sensory aversions. The food one is the most serious because it affects nutrition. And I have some really good resources for you on that I will leave in the box below. But please get a feeding therapist involved if your child has a lot of sensory issues or problems with eating. If there are lots of foods that your child just won't eat, it's important to get that addressed at an early age, because the earlier we start working on it, the more progress we will see, and the less your child might fall behind in appropriate nutrition. There are other things that are aversive to kids as well, mud or sticky things. And I will do a video, my next video will be about how to work on addressing those sensory avoidance difficulties, because they can really affect a family, they can really affect a classroom, and they really do affect a child's life. In my case, I was born so long ago that nobody knew about differences in the sensory system. They just told kids they were picky and they needed to shape up. However, now we know better, so we can do better. And I will discuss that more in my next video. So if you don't mind, come back and listen to that, and I will see you then. Have a great day. Bye.